I arrived home that late Thursday afternoon feeling confident about life. The weather had been perfect for work, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening by the lake. My plan was to spend a few hours tending to my father's old sailboat, then watch the sun sink beneath the pines. That serene image shattered the moment I spotted a neon notice pinned to my front door. It was the kind of fluorescent color you couldn't ignore if you tried. Squinting under the last rays of daylight, I tore the paper from the doorframe and discovered, to my dismay, the letterhead of the Green Arbor Lakeside HOA, with the name Karen White scrawled in bold ink. The first line stated that I was in violation of newly amended community standards. The second line ordered me to remove my boat from the shoreline within 30 days. My stomach tightened, and a cold wave of anger surged beneath my ribs. My father's boat was more than a piece of property. It was a tangible reminder of the times we'd spent together. A vessel that carried memories of summer winds, calm dawns, and every bittersweet moment in between. In that single instant, I realized a war was about to begin, even if I'd never intended to start one. I dropped my keys, had to bend and retrieve them from the welcome mat, then forced myself to read the entire notice without letting emotion blind me to the details. The language was formal, but laced with condescension. It claimed my aging, unsightly watercraft was detrimental to the unified appearance of our lovely lakeside community. And on, about property values, about establishing a modern aesthetic. Then it threatened daily fines if I failed to remove the sailboat within the specified time frame. I glanced at the final block of text where Karen White signed her name as president of the Green Arbor Lakeside HOA. Until that very moment, I'd only known her in passing, a statuesque brunette who wore crisp blazers and stiletto heels, parading around the community center with an air of self-importance. I had occasionally greeted her with a polite nod whenever we crossed paths, never suspecting she would target me or the piece of my father's legacy bobbing gently behind my house. Standing there on my porch, I felt torn between seething rage and icy disbelief. For months, I'd cherished the tranquility of living by the water, assuming that neighbors here were kind-hearted, that the HOA was a benign presence. But the tone of that letter suggested I'd been naive. With a deep sigh, I made my way around the side of the house to the dock, letting the hush of twilight calm my nerves. The boat was exactly as it had always been, a modest 30-foot sloop named the Aveline, her hull painted a warm cream color, her teak accents polished to a gentle shine. My father had taught me to sail on the Aveline when I was barely 12. He'd shown me how to tie a proper bowline knot, how to sense the wind's shift against my cheek, how to find the best tack even when the breeze refused to cooperate. Some of my earliest lessons in patience and persistence were forged on that vessel. Losing it or discarding it would be unthinkable. No matter what Karen White believed or how vigorously she tried to enforce her so-called new rules, I wasn't going to back down. That night, I barely slept. Images of the lake, the boat, and the neon notice swirled in my mind until the first hint of dawn seeped through my window. The next morning, I decided not to waste time. I called the HOA's main line, hoping to speak directly with Karen. A weary-sounding receptionist answered, told me Miss White was in a meeting, and insisted that any objections to a violation must be addressed in writing or at the next monthly board session. That was 2 weeks away. My protest that a letter demanded I remove my boat in 30 days fell on deaf ears. The receptionist repeated the standard phrase, "Submit your concerns formally, sir. The board will review them at the upcoming meeting." My frustration flared. The entire operation felt like a fortress of bureaucratic obstacles designed to wear me down. Gripping the phone, I responded as calmly as I could manage. "Fine, I'll see you at the meeting." Determined to gather evidence for my defense, I rummaged through the official HOA bylaws provided when I bought the house. Those documents went on for pages, about lawn care, external paint colors, fence heights, even how many ornamental lights were permissible during the holidays. Yet, nowhere did it mention anything that specifically banned older boats from the shoreline. Under a section labeled Marine Guidelines, There was a vague reference to maintaining watercraft in good condition, free from hazards. The Aveline was far from hazardous. I spent nearly every weekend caring for her, scraping off any hint of barnacles, making sure her sails were folded, keeping the teak trimmed and well-oiled. If anything, she was better maintained than several neighbors' motorboats. My curious I quickly turned into anger as I realized that either Karen was misapplying a rule or she had invented a brand new guideline without going through proper channels. For clarity, I spoke to my next-door neighbor, an older gentleman named Walt, who had lived in the neighborhood since its inception. He'd actually served on the HOA board years before stepping down. When I mentioned the notice, his brow furrowed in concern. He said he'd never heard of any standard that specifically targeted older boats. Walt sipped his coffee, glanced toward the lake, and told me a few stories about the new HOA president. Apparently, Karen White had come into power about a year prior, championing what she called community enhancement initiatives. He rolled his eyes at that phrase, describing how she'd begun fining people for minor infractions. Garden gnomes deemed inappropriate, a mismatch of flower bed colors, a doghouse that allegedly clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. "She's a perfectionist," Walt muttered, "and if you're not on her good side, you'd better watch out." When I asked if she had any reason to harbor ill will toward me specifically, Walt shrugged. "Might just be your turn. Maybe she doesn't like the look of your boat's mast, or maybe she saw you as an easy target." None of it was comforting. If she had singled me out, there had to be a motive. The next few days passed in tense quiet. I tried focusing on work, ignoring the gnawing sense of injustice that simmered at the back of my mind, but every day I'd receive some mention of Karen's new decrees from a fellow neighbor. It seemed she was on a rampage, dictating how tall hedges could be, how many cars one could park in front of a house, and even where trash bins should be stored. Yet my boat appeared to be at the top of her priorities. Mine was the only watercraft to get a formal violation. On a hunch, I decided to check the local county records office to see if there was anything peculiar about my property lines. My house sat along a curve of the lake with a short dock, while the community-owned Marina jutted from a wider portion of the shore a bit farther down. I wasn't expecting to find anything groundbreaking. I merely hoped for clarity on whether the HOA had any additional authority over my portion of lake access. When I arrived at the records office, the clerk guided me to an area filled with old surveys, property maps, and historical development documents. Leafing through them under fluorescent lights, I stumbled on an outdated blueprint that showed how the lakefront parcels were originally plotted. There was a slender strip of land that appeared to extend from what was now my backyard toward a narrower tract close to the marina. A series of legal notations indicated that the developers had intended to turn that strip into a walkway or something similar, but as I read further, I couldn't see an official, completed record of the land being transferred to the HOA. A wave of speculation washed over me. If that land wasn't properly deeded to the association, then maybe part of the route leading to the marina still belonged to my property. Dismissing the idea as too bizarre, I scanned more maps, but the possibility kept nagging at me. Once home, I tried to match the lines on those older documents with the modern boundaries visible on my purchase papers. The numbers and angles were too confusing, so I decided to call a professional surveyor to see if there was any truth to my wild guess. Meanwhile, I had 2 more weeks until the next HOA board meeting. My frustration grew daily. So did my resolve. If Karen insisted on threatening my father's boat, I'd push back. The surveyor, Melissa Barnes, agreed to meet me on a Sunday morning to walk the property and take new measurements. She arrived with a bundle of equipment and an assistant, and they spent hours analyzing points on the shoreline, scanning everything from old boundary markers to topographical data. As the day wore on, Melissa's expression became more guarded. She double-checked her instruments, cross-referenced the older maps, and finally approached me with a measured look. "This is preliminary," she said, "but based on these readings, it seems your property extends farther than what's listed on your most recent deed. There's a discrepancy in the southwestern boundary near the lake. It appears that an approximately 5-foot wide strip might still belong to you." She hesitated. "That strip could be critical because it aligns almost exactly with the main footpath that leads to the HOA Marina. I'll do a final analysis back at my office, but so far, that's what the numbers show." A swirl of emotions seized me: surprise, elation, apprehension. If this was accurate, it meant I had an unexpected piece of leverage against Karen White. A part of me felt guilty for feeling triumphant at the idea of blocking the Marina path. I pictured families hauling fishing gear, children running down to the docks, neighbors who had nothing to do with the HOA drama. I didn't want to cause them grief. On the other hand, Karen's bullying tactics had made it clear she wasn't going to listen to reason. Perhaps this was my only recourse. All the while, the days inched closer to that board meeting. The weekend before it, I received another note from the HOA telling me I was now subject to an initial fine for non-compliance, and that continued refusal to remove the Aveline would escalate the matter. Reading that, I felt my face go hot with fury. Karen was accelerating her attack, refusing to wait for a formal discussion. She wanted me gone, or she wanted the boat gone. In her mind, it was probably the same thing. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early to the community center, a modest building with a high-peaked roof and cheerful flower beds at the entrance. Inside, the board members sat behind a long table. Karen occupied the center seat, wearing a fitted blazer and maintaining an air of authority. On her left sat Sylvia, the board secretary, who rarely looked up from her notepad. On Karen's right was Martin, the treasurer, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a perpetually uneasy expression. A handful of residents gathered in chairs arranged in neat rows. This time, the attendance looked higher than usual, likely because word had spread about the boat controversy. Once the usual business was addressed, some landscaping budgets and a proposal for redoing the tennis courts, Karen opened the floor for any outstanding violations or homeowner comments. This was my cue. Heart pounding, I stood and introduced myself, explaining calmly that I was there to dispute the violation against my father's sailboat. I stated the facts: the boat's well-maintained condition, the lack of any written rule banning older vessels, and the questionable basis of the so-called modernization guidelines that Karen claimed to be enforcing. My voice only trembled once, but I steadied it, reminding myself that my entire case depended on logic and clarity. As I finished, Karen gave me a thin, patient smile, as though addressing a troublesome student. "Our standards have evolved," she began, "to keep property values high and ensure a cohesive look along the shoreline. Your boat, though evidently important to you, does not fit that updated vision. If you wish to maintain a presence here, you must comply." It's a unanimous decision of the board. Several neighbors whispered among themselves. A few looked at me sympathetically. Others avoided my gaze. One older couple seemed to nod in agreement with Karen, possibly because they believed that preserving property values warranted such strict measures. I stood my ground. "There's nothing in the official bylaws about boat age or style," I retorted. Karen's expression shifted slightly, and she nodded for Martin to speak. Clearing his throat, he read some prepared notes that indicated the board had discretionary power to create new guidelines in the best interests of the community. But when I asked if the membership had voted on such guidelines, Martin fumbled. "We're in the process of finalizing them," he mumbled. That was my opening. With the entire room listening, I produced the preliminary findings from Melissa Barnes's survey, noting the property line anomaly. I asserted that the strip leading to the marina might in fact belong to my lot. A stunned murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's cheeks flushed a slight pink, but her self-response was remarkable. She responded with an air of dismissive disbelief. "That's impossible. The path to the marina has always been part of our common areas. We have records on file proving that." Her tone hinted that she considered me a troublemaker grasping at straws, but I had brought copies of the old documents, pointing out that the county's official records never completed the transfer to the HOA. I summarized, "I'm not looking to disrupt the community. However, if the board insists on enforcing a rule that doesn't exist, compelling me to remove a cherished heirloom, then I'll have no choice but to assert my rights over this boundary. And that could mean blocking the only footpath to the marina. A collective hush fell over the room. I saw Walt in the back, arms crossed, nodding in silent support. Karen tried to keep her expression neutral, but the tension around her eyes betrayed her anger. "We'll need to see those documents in detail. Ms. White can't respond to claims like this out of the blue," said Sylvia, looking flustered. Karen drummed her manicured nails on the table. "We'll review them," she said tersely. "But let's make one thing clear. The board doesn't appreciate threats. If you intend to hinder access to the marina, you'll be infringing on the rights of everyone else in Green Arbor Lakeside. That won't go over well." She then moved to close the topic, tapping a small gavel. The meeting proceeded to other agenda items. I sat down, heart racing, uncertain if I'd just lit a fuse or prevented a bomb from going off. In either case, lines had been drawn. By the end of the meeting, half the neighbors gave me cautious smiles. The other half seemed to avoid eye contact like they feared picking sides. As the days passed, I expected a direct response from Karen or the board, maybe some letter acknowledging the property line dispute or an offer to talk. Instead, I got another official notice in the mail, quoting the same threat of fines. If anything, the tone was more rigid, referencing legal actions that the HOA could take. It felt like Karen had dismissed my warnings, or possibly believed she could outmaneuver me. My frustration boiled over. I decided to reach out to an attorney, Rachel Meyer, who specialized in real estate conflicts, particularly with HOAs. She was a cool-headed professional. After hearing my story and glancing at the surveyor's preliminary notes, she nodded thoughtfully. "If you truly own that strip, you can fence it, but that's a very aggressive move. Usually we'd try to negotiate a proper easement or come to a mutual agreement. Are you prepared to escalate?" I thought about all the neighbors who might be inconvenienced. Then I recalled the injustice of that neon letter, the threat to my father's legacy. "I'll do it if they force my hand," I said quietly. Rachel sent a notice on my behalf to the HOA, requesting a formal mediation and providing the data from the survey. We hoped Karen would see reason, realize that I wasn't bluffing, and concede that the Aveline was allowed to remain. Days passed. We received no response other than a brief email from the board's generic account stating, "Your request is under review. In the meantime, compliance deadlines remain in effect." Rachel cocked an eyebrow when she read it. "They're basically ignoring you," she observed. "Sometimes HOAs bank on homeowners caving rather than spending time and money on legal fights. If you're willing to stand your ground, it might get intense." That weekend, I spotted Karen marching along the lake's perimeter with a clipboard and two of her close allies, scanning backyards, pointing at various properties as if she were cataloging infractions. When she reached the boundary near my dock, I strolled over to greet them. Her expression sharpened, but she forced a polite smile. Before she could speak, I calmly inquired, "Have you had a chance to look at the documents my lawyer sent?" She pursed her lips. "Yes, we're consulting the association's legal counsel. We still believe you're mistaken. That path has always been communal, and your boat remains in violation." One of her allies, a tall man named Derek, nodded vigorously. I found myself biting back a retort. The entire conversation felt pointless, so I simply said, "Then we'll see how things play out," and walked away. I imagined how things might escalate, me fencing off that path, neighbors in an uproar, potential lawsuits. The scenario churned in my mind, making me grimace. The next morning, a Sunday, I headed to my front porch to pick up the newspaper and saw something that made my blood run cold. A small, typed note, unsigned, that read, "Back off or you'll regret it." I glanced around, half expecting to see some shadowy figure lurking, but the street was quiet, the air still. I doubted Karen would stoop to this tactic, but maybe she had supporters who felt threatened by my defiance. Heart pounding, I shredded the note, then paused. If intimidation was the tactic, it wouldn't change my stance. I decided I wouldn't mention it to many people unless it happened again. Better to keep calm and press forward. That day, I fully understood how personal and nasty HOA disputes could get when someone in power decided to dig in their heels. On Monday, I received an update from Melissa Barnes. The final survey was complete and it confirmed what I suspected. The official property line indeed encompassed the very corridor that led from my yard to the marina entrance. The oversight dated back to the original developer's incomplete paperwork. That developer had presumably intended to deed the area to the association, but never finalized it. County records simply never updated the ownership. Melissa's tone was apologetic, as though she felt sorry the neighborhood was entangled in such a bureaucratic mess. But she also made it clear that, from a legal standpoint, I had the upper hand. I took the step I'd been dreading, calling a local fencing company. The owner, Isaac Harper, was a genial man who asked for a rough idea of the job. When I mentioned the HOA, he chuckled. He'd done fences around here before, usually for homeowners trying to comply with new rules about property lines, but he'd never heard of someone blocking a communal path. "You sure about this?" he asked, not unkindly. I said I was. I set an insulation date for the following week, praying that Karen would come to her senses before then. Maybe the mere knowledge that I'd hired a fence contractor would force her to relent. But days passed, and her silence spoke volumes. The night before the fence work was scheduled, I stood at the water's edge, letting the gentle lap of waves calm me. In the distance, I could see the row of slips at the marina, some filled with pontoon boats, others with polished speedboats. Families lived in those houses, people who'd done nothing to wrong me, and yet they would bear the brunt of Karen's stubbornness if the path were closed. I felt guilt, but I also felt that if I caved in, it would set a precedent for Karen to bully me, and possibly others, on a whim. My father's memory flickered in my mind. He had always preached standing up for what's right, even if it's not the popular choice. That gave me the courage to see it through. Bright and early the next day, Isaac's crew arrived. They backed a truck into my driveway, unloaded cedar planks, a stack of posts, bags of concrete mix, and got to work. Each time the nail gun fired, a pang of finality resonated in my gut. The barrier was physically taking shape. I helped guide them along the boundary, showing them where the survey stakes were. We had to ensure no portion of the fence crossed outside my property. By mid-morning, word must have spread, because I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. I turned and saw Karen pulling up in a sleek SUV, looking more incensed than I'd ever seen her. She slammed the driver's door and marched up, her high heels tapping a furious rhythm across the pavement. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" she demanded. I took a steadying breath, explained calmly that since she refused to drop the baseless violation, I was affirming my property rights. She retorted, "You'll ruin everything. The entire community depends on marina access." "I know," I said, "and I'm not happy about it, but you gave me no choice." She threatened to call the police and labeled my actions illegal. I shrugged, pointed to Melissa Barnes's formal survey documentation, and invited her to confirm it with the county. "If I'm mistaken, take me to court," I said, "but until then, this fence stays." Her voice rose. She said I was punishing everyone just because I wanted to keep an ugly eyesore of a boat. That line, denigrating my father's boat, cut deep, but I refused to let it show. Instead, I turned away, leaving her to glare at the fence crew. Some minutes later, a police cruiser did indeed arrive, summoned by Karen. The responding officer spoke with me, inspected my paperwork, nodded politely, and said, "This looks like a civil matter, sir. If the association has a dispute, they'll have to file a complaint. You're within your rights if the survey is accurate." Karen, overhearing that, looked livid. The officer left, presumably with no basis to intervene. By midday, the fence was halfway done. It ran in a neat line along my property, turning just enough to intersect with the main path to the marina. I'd asked Isaac to include a gate in the design, locked for now, but potentially usable in the future if the HOA came to an arrangement. As the hours passed, neighbors gathered, whispering. A few approached me. One was Tanya, a mother of two who said her kids loved to go fishing at the marina. She pleaded, "Isn't there a way to solve this without shutting us out?" Her eyes were genuinely distressed, and I felt a spike of guilt. I explained as best I could that I'd tried reasoning with Karen, that I had no desire to harm the community. Tanya sighed, thanked me for my honesty, and walked away with a resigned expression. I hated feeling like a villain, but frustration with Karen overshadowed that guilt. Reminding me how many times I'd tried to negotiate or talk, she'd stonewalled me at every turn, leaving me to make this radical choice. By late afternoon, the fence was complete. Sturdy, tall enough to deter anyone from climbing over, made of handsome cedar planks. The gate had a solid padlock that only I could open. In effect, I held the key to the marina's land access. At that point, the only ways to get there were by boat from another lot or a complicated route that cut through some brush on the far side of the community. Hardly convenient. The result was immediate chaos. Karen stormed around, complaining that I'd cost her the loyalty of some board members, who were now furious that she'd allowed the situation to escalate. Neighbors who had been indifferent or neutral realized the gravity of the blockade. Some demanded an emergency HOA meeting. Others quietly approached me, wanting details on why I had done it and whether there was a path to resolve it. A day later, I received word that the HOA had scheduled a special session to address the breach of community property. They used inflammatory language in the notice, calling my fence an act of aggression. I had no doubt Karen was behind that phrasing. My attorney Rachel rolled her eyes upon reading it. They'll probably try to scare you with legal threats, but if you truly own that strip, they have little ground. We'll attend the session, calmly present our side, and hopefully push for a settlement. When the evening of the special session arrived, the community center buzzed with tension. Some residents glared at me as I walked in with Rachel. Others nodded sympathetically. Karen presided at the table, flanked by her loyal allies. The discussion started with a list of allegations, accusing me of damaging common land, sabotaging the neighborhood's marina usage, and so forth. Rachel swiftly rebutted by laying out the property records, the new survey, and the attempts we'd made to resolve matters peaceably. At one point, Karen launched into a diatribe about my boat, proclaiming it was the real reason the community was in turmoil. If he had just cooperated and removed his dilapidated sailboat, she began. I cut her off, fists clenched under the table. It's not dilapidated. You've lied about its condition from day one, and you never showed me a single official rule banning it. Why should I comply with your personal preference? A ripple of reaction passed through the audience. Some folks seemed to be seeing the bigger picture now, that Karen's vendetta against my boat was irrational. A few even murmured that they'd never understood her fixation. Realizing she was losing the moral high ground, Karen tried a different tactic, claiming that the community had collectively agreed on new aesthetic standards and that I was out of line. Rachel asked for a copy of the official vote, which of course did not exist. As the tension mounted, one older board member, Florence, stood up and revealed that she too had grown suspicious of Karen's methods. She admitted that Karen had never followed proper procedures for adopting new guidelines, nor had she consulted the entire board for many decisions. A few other neighbors, emboldened, recounted how Karen had pressured them with arbitrary fines or called out minor flaws in their yards. I watched Karen's composure slip. She forced a tight smile that wavered around the edges. At the end of the night, the board voted to table any further enforcement actions against me, pending a full audit of how new rules were developed. They also asked me to consider unlocking the gate temporarily for the sake of community harmony. I glanced at Rachel, who shrugged, leaving the choice to me. Finally, I said I would think about it if the HOA immediately rescinded all fines and violations against my boat. Karen refused to consent, so the night ended in a stalemate. People filed out, hushed, uncertain of what would happen next. Over the following days, an unexpected whistleblower stepped forward. I received an anonymous email from a user named Concerned Citizen, containing digital attachments that linked Karen White to a company known for acquiring lakeside properties renovating them into upscale resorts and flipping them for hefty profits. The attachment suggested that Karen had been working on a scheme to devalue the property around the marina, drive out certain residents, and then partner with this company to redevelop the waterfront. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the documents. They included lists of addresses that had recently sold below market value, each one correlated with owners who'd received a string of harassing notices, or who'd been singled out by arbitrary HOA crackdowns. The plan, apparently, was to buy up these properties cheaply once the residents were fed up, then rezone and build a high-end facility that would cater to wealthy vacationers. My father's boat, an older sailboat, didn't fit the sleek, uniform aesthetic Karen envisioned. She probably wanted it gone as part of her larger plan to transform our community into a polished resort area, free of dated eyesores. Feeling a mix of vindication and outrage, I promptly shared these findings with my attorney, who said this was more than enough evidence to question Karen's ethics. We decided to hold a neighborhood gathering on my lawn, inviting as many people as we could reach. The fence still barred the path to the marina, so my backyard offered a private but symbolic location for unveiling the truth. Word spread rapidly. On a balmy Saturday afternoon, dozens of residents assembled. I pinned the printouts and emails on a large easel, explaining how I'd received them from an anonymous source. I walked everyone through the timeline of Karen's actions, her rise to the HOA presidency, her bogus citations, the suspicious pattern of forced sales, the deals with that private development corporation. Neighbors gasped. Some cursed under their breath. Some whispered that they had suspected something but never had proof. This was the smoking gun. Midway through my presentation, I saw Karen approaching at the edge of the crowd, arms folded, flanked by a few loyal supporters. She tried to interject, accusing me of spreading lies. I calmly offered her the microphone, telling her to address the documents if they were fake. Instead, she blustered about defamation and how I was harming the community with baseless claims. I pointed to the lines of emails, the property transactions, and said, "Explain these connections then. Show us that you haven't been using the HOA to push people out." The silence from Karen was deafening. Her supporters shifted uneasily, clearly unsettled by the evidence. The rest of the neighbors stared at her with outrage. She tried to say the materials were forged, but my attorney chimed in, stating that if Karen believed the documents were fraudulent, we'd welcome a forensic investigation. By now, the crowd's mood was firmly against Karen. People started shouting questions about the latest fines they had received, about bizarre demands for landscaping that no one else had to follow, about rumors that she was receiving kickbacks from a certain contractor who handled approved renovations. Karen's face reddened. Her composure broke. She stammered something about the community's best interests, but no one was buying it anymore. One resident demanded an immediate vote of no confidence. Another stood up and declared that the board needed an overhaul. The calls for Karen's resignation grew louder, and eventually she just stormed off, practically yanking her supporters with her. That day, the entire facade she'd built came crashing down. In the following week, an emergency HOA election was organized. Many of Karen's allies deserted her, afraid of the backlash. Her critics formed a group that promised transparency and fairness, uniting under the slogan, "Neighbors, not tyrants." The day of the vote was chaotic. Lines formed outside the community center, people talking passionately about how they wanted the old ways gone, how they wanted official checks on HOA. By the time votes were tallied, Karen was removed from her position, replaced by a new board led by individuals who pledged to rectify the association's structure. Facing the onslaught of evidence, Karen resigned and put her house up for sale shortly thereafter. Some claimed she moved out of state to avoid further scrutiny. Although she never openly admitted her scheme, the documents and pattern of harassment painted a damning picture. With Karen gone, the new board wasted no time in contacting me. They dropped every citation regarding my boat, removed the fines, and asked politely if I would reopen the path to the marina for the common good. I said I would, on two conditions. First, They had to sign a formal easement agreement acknowledging my ownership of the strip, guaranteeing I'd never again be harassed about docking my father's boat behind my house. Second, they had to adopt a transparent process for any new community guidelines, requiring a majority vote from all homeowners. The new president, a genial man named Allen, agreed to these terms without hesitation. Within days, we drafted and signed the contract. I unlocked the gate, leaving it unlatched most of the time so that neighbors could pass freely. Some folks thanked me personally. They understood that I'd gone to drastic lengths only because Karen had left me no alternative. The sense of relief that settled over Green Arbor Lakeside was palpable. People began sharing stories of how threatened they'd felt under Karen's regime, how some had nearly sold their homes in despair. The new board initiated an audit of past HOA expenses, uncovering suspicious transactions that suggested Karen had funneled a portion of association funds into development research, presumably to prepare for the day her partner corporation would swoop in and transform the waterfront. The more the new board dug, the more they revealed. Residents realized how close they'd come to losing the character of their community. Ironically, my father's beloved boat and the fence fiasco turned out to be the catalyst that exposed Karen's entire operation. In the subsequent weeks, the atmosphere around my house felt lighter. I removed the padlock on the fence gate, replacing it with a simple latch so people could access the marina while still respecting the property boundary. Neighbors would wave at me or stop by just to say hello, relieved that the era of random citations was over. Some even volunteered to help me maintain the Aveline, offering to buff the hull or polish the rails as a thank you for standing my ground. Despite the tension that had gone on, I felt a renewed sense of community. Ironically, all this strife had pulled people closer together. The local kids resumed skipping down to the marina with fishing rods in hand. Older couples strolled by in the evenings, greeting me with friendly banter. It was everything I'd originally hoped for when I chose to live in a lakeside neighborhood. Not a place ruled by petty tyrants, but a place of mutual respect and neighborly goodwill. I spent more time on the water, reacquainting myself with the gentle rocking of the Aveline. The hiss of wind in the sails brought back cherished memories of my father's guidance. Occasionally, I'd invite some neighbors who'd never sailed before, giving them a little introduction to tacking and jibing, smiling at their wide-eyed wonder when the breeze filled the sails and we cut across the lake with exhilarating speed. In those moments, I realized that the boat Karen had called an eyesore was, in truth, a vessel carrying not just my memories, but the very spirit of community and tradition that she'd tried to stamp out. The fresh leadership of the HOA implemented an open-door policy, inviting all homeowners to monthly gatherings where they could propose ideas, raise concerns, and ensure no single person held unchecked power. For the first time, the HOA budget was presented with a thorough breakdown, and committees formed to handle specific tasks: landscaping, social events, lake cleanup. This transparent approach eased suspicions and gave everyone a sense of ownership in local affairs. The meltdown that occurred under Karen's watch now served as a cautionary tale about how quickly governance can become tyrannical if left unchecked. Sometimes I would catch myself wondering what Karen was up to. She'd never returned to the neighborhood after the election fiasco, as far as I knew. Some rumored that she still owned a small property in a neighboring county, but no one seemed eager to investigate. The mention of her name always prompted a tense pause, followed by a sigh of relief that she was gone. One day, I overheard a couple of neighbors discussing a possible class action suit against her for misappropriation of HOA funds, but I wasn't sure if that ever materialized. Perhaps people preferred to close that chapter and move on, savoring the community's renewed harmony. One crisp autumn morning, I found myself leaning against a fence, sipping coffee while gazing at the shimmering lake. A few weeks had passed since the ordeal concluded. The air smelled of dried leaves and faint wood smoke from distant chimneys. The marina was bustling with activity. Someone was winterizing a pontoon, another was carefully removing a sail from the mast. My fence, once a stark emblem of defiance, now looked like a natural extension of my property. A neighbor I'd never met approached me, introduced himself as Jared, and said he'd only recently moved in. He'd heard bits and pieces of the drama with Karen, and he wanted the full story. So I told him, from beginning to end, how a neon note on my door escalated into a scandal that toppled the HOA president. His eyes widened. Then he said, "I guess you never know how powerful someone can be until you threaten their ambition." We both laughed, acknowledging the truth of that statement. Before he left, Jared added, "Glad you stood up for your boat, and for all of us." That evening, I took the Avalon out for a final sail before the cooler months settled in. The lake stretched out smooth as glass, tinted by the pastel hues of the dying sunset. The gentle motion of the hull brought back those comforting lessons from my father. How to remain calm under pressure, how to adapt to sudden shifts in the wind. I thought about how none of this would have come to light if I had blindly complied, removing the boat without a fight. It reminded me that sometimes resisting unfair demands leads to revelations far more significant than the initial grievance. The boat was the spark, but the real blaze was Karen's unchecked ambition, burning through the heart of our neighborhood until it was finally exposed. Friends occasionally joke that the fence I built saved Green Arbor Lakeside. I'm not sure I'd phrase it exactly that way, but I do recognize that taking a stand, manifested in those tall cedar planks, forced a reckoning that might otherwise have been delayed for years or never come at all. My father, if he were alive, would probably grin at the irony that his humble sailboat, an emblem of relaxation and reflection, became the catalyst for halting a corrupt agenda. In the months since, life has settled into a pleasant hum. I'll receive an occasional email update from the new HOA board, usually about a neighborhood barbecue or a volunteer day to clean up litter around the lake. They keep me in the loop if any discussions arise about new bylaw amendments, inviting me to weigh in. I'm no fan of politics, but it's nice to know that the association is trying to be inclusive and fair. Once in a while, a neighbor will spot me tinkering with the Avalon and shout, "Looking good," or ask if they can bring a friend along for the next sailing trip. That sense of unity is the polar opposite of the tension we endured under Karen's regime. In quiet reflection, I see how conflict can sometimes be the birthplace of a stronger, healthier community if truth and perseverance are on one's side. The illusions and intimidation Karen employed crumbled when confronted by collective awareness. In the end, it was the entire neighborhood that taught her a lesson. No single person can bend a community's spirit to their will if everyone else decides to stand together. Occasionally, I'll get asked by curious acquaintances if I'd ever consider removing the fence entirely now that the crisis is over. I shake my head. It's still my property line after all, and that fence represents an important chapter in our local history. However, the gate remains unlocked most of the time, a gesture of goodwill. People appreciate that I'm not punishing them or holding the Marina hostage. If the new board ever tries to infringe on my rights again, which I doubt they will, they'll remember the fiasco that fence provoked. It stands as a testament to boundary lines, both literal and metaphorical, that should never be crossed without fair negotiation. It also stands as a quiet warning. I sometimes wonder if, a decade from now, folks will still talk about the day I fenced off the entire Marina path. Maybe they'll tell new residents about the fiasco, or laugh at the absurdity of how a sailboat triggered a revolution. My hope is that the story endures as a lesson, that no matter how mundane or petty a battle might seem at first, deeper truths can be uncovered when you refuse to roll over for bullies. Each time I see children skip freely down that path or neighbors pause to admire the lake at dusk, I'm reminded of the outcome we fought for, a shared space with real camaraderie. My father's boat remains exactly where it belongs, bobbing softly at its mooring, a silent but powerful reminder of what it costs to protect it. Every now and then, while adjusting the sails or polishing the rails, I recall how close I came to capitulating the moment I read that first neon notice. Fear and self-doubt whispered that it was just a boat, that I should keep my head down and comply. After all, who wants to tangle with an HOA president known for her ruthless fines? But the memory of my father's weathered hands guiding mine over the rigging kept me firm in my resolve, and I imagined how disappointed he would have been if I'd given up his cherished vassal without so much as a fight. In that sense, the fence and all its repercussions stand as an homage to his courage. At times, life's storms are external, like the gales that threaten to tear apart my peaceful lakefront existence. Sometimes they are internal, swirling in our hearts as we wrestle with moral choices. Yet, as my father taught me, the key is to navigate those gusts without losing your moral compass. I can't speak for everyone, but for me, preserving the Aveline was never just about a piece of property. It was about defending the values I hold dear: family, fairness, and the right to live peacefully without manipulation. The final scene of this conflict ended not with bitterness, but with renewed ties and a collective willingness to safeguard each other from future abuses of power. Whenever the sun sets and the water reflects the fiery sky, I'm reminded that harmony can be fragile. It takes vigilance from everyone to maintain, yet I believe we came out stronger. No longer do I catch neighbors glancing furtively over their shoulders, worried about a petty citation. The atmosphere feels more relaxed, more welcoming. By confronting a bully who cloaked herself in officialdom, we cleared a path for genuine unity. In the gentle hush of twilight, the sound of the Aveline's hull cutting through the water tells me we did right by each other and by those who might move here in the future. Sometimes I still find it surreal how a single letter on a neon sheet of paper started all of this. Small events can trigger grand transformations if the spark is allowed to grow. Now, as the waves sway beneath my deck, I often reflect on how conflict revealed the best and worst in people. Karen's deceit, my defiance, the community's collective uproar. Each piece of that puzzle had to collide to produce the final picture of a neighborhood that could stand proud, unafraid of hidden agendas. Ultimately, that is the greatest victory. Not that I saved my father's boat, but that we found our voice, realized we had power to shape our community's destiny, and used it to cast out corruption. The water laps softly against the side of the Aveline, rocking me gently as if to say, we all earned this peace. We all charted this new course. And to anyone who might be tempted to reintroduce greed or injustice, our answer is as solid as the fence that still marks my boundary. We won't let such ambitions intrude again.